الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نعم اقرأ. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نعم, so moving on, we were going through some of the ruwat of al-Muwaṭṭa, the ones that have transmitted the Muwaṭṭa from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And we mentioned two famous ones. Number one was Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, and number two was Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri. The third rawi is Sa'id ibn Ufayr, who is Sa'id ibn Kathir ibn Ufayr ibn Muslim ibn Yazid ibn al-Aswad al-Ansari mawlahum Abu Uthman, who passed away in the year 226. And some scholars have done kalam upon him, such as Al-Juzjani. However, Ibn Adi, he says, وهذا الذي قاله لا معنى له ولم أسمع أحدا ولا بلغني أن أحد من الناس كلاما في سعيد بن كثير بن عفير وهو عند الناس صدوق. He says that the kalam that Al-Juzjani has against Sa'id ibn Ufayr, he says, I've never heard anyone say this or such harsh kalam against him. In reality, he is considered saduq and he is acceptable and trustworthy amongst the people, yani the scholars of hadith. وَقَدْ حَدَّثَ عَنْهُ الْأَئِمَّةُ مِنَ النَّاسِ. And Ibn Ma'in, he used to say that I seen three amazing things in Egypt: An-Nil, wal-Ahram, wa Sa'id ibn Ufayr. The Nile River and the pyramids, and number three, Sa'id ibn Ufayr. And Al-Dhahabi, he says, it's enough that an imam such as Yahya bin Ma'in is shocked and amazed at Sa'id ibn Ufayr. So Sa'id ibn Ufayr, he was from Egypt, and he also transmitted the Muwaṭṭa from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, and he's acceptable, he's trustworthy, even though some have done kalam upon him. However, their kalam is not in his place. Number four is the riwayah of Sulaiman ibn Burd. And he was also from the fuqaha of Egypt and the judges of Egypt. And he's also accepted. And he heard the Muwaṭṭa from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala as well. Number five is the riwayah of Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, Abu Abdullah al-Misri al-Faqih, who's also from Egypt. So all three of these great a'imma are from Egypt. And so the madhab of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, it also spread in the time of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala towards Egypt and the western part of Africa. Regarding Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, a lot of great scholars such as Ibn Ma'in and Abu Zur'a and An-Nasa'i and Al-Hakim and Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and others have done tawthiq of him, meaning he is also a thiqah. And another benefit is that the sama' of Ibn al-Qasim, Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala occurred later on. In fact, Ibn Waddah, he says, سمع عبد القاسم من المصريين والشاميين وإنما طلب وهو كبير ولم يخرج لمالك حتى سمع من المصريين. Then he says, وأنفق في سفرته إلى مالك ألف مثقال. He says, Ibn al-Qasim, rahimahullah ta'ala, initially he heard from the scholars of Egypt and the scholars of Sham. And he studied the Muwaṭṭa before he went to Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And he started studying ilm at an old age. And over here we'll pause and maybe speak about this for a little while. Yes, the best is for a student to start studying ilm, start studying knowledge at a younger age. And especially that which the student memorizes at a young age, that is something which he will always remember. And it's very difficult for someone, if they memorized something at a young age, for them to forget it. But even then, we have a number of examples of great ulama and scholars that studied ilm at an old age. Meaning they started their journey of talabul ilm in an old age. From them is one of the most famous ulama, one of the most famous scholars, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala himself. And many others, where they started the seeking of ilm and their pursuit of knowledge at an older age. So yes, at a younger age it's better, always. But that does not mean that a person who studies later on is not able to become a scholar. The Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, the majority of them, they accepted Islam, or many of them, they accepted Islam at an old age. Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he's only 2 years younger than the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the Messenger received nubuwah. The Messenger was the age of 40 sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the age of 38. But yet we say he is such a great alim, the most knowledgeable of all of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, the greatest of all of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum. So age is not something that should demotivate an individual. Even if someone reaches an old age, if he spends time in talabul ilm, that is something which is praiseworthy. That is something which is praiseworthy. Until today, subhanAllah, sometimes you meet individuals that they've reached the age of 60, some of them 70, they have grandchildren, and they memorize the Quran at that old age. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants tawfiq to certain people, and that is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's never too late to start pursuing knowledge. And every single moment a person spends in the talab of ilm, he will be rewarded for it. Likewise, Ibn Waddah said regarding Ibn al-Qasim that he spent a lot of money to travel to visit Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is also the default in talab al-ilm. The default when it comes to studying, we say al-ilmu yu'ta wa la ya'ti. Ilm is sought. Ilm doesn't come knocking on your door. And this is extremely important for a student of knowledge to remember. A talibul ilm always is the one pursuing and seeking knowledge. And he's not waiting for it to come knocking on his door. The ulama of the past, or the talabatul ilm of the past, many of them, they would travel far, far distances for the sake of sometimes one hadith or for the sake of meeting a great alim. And they were not concerned with the fact that they would have to spend a lot of wealth and a lot of time away from their homes. And they understood that ilm is something which is sought. And it's not something which comes knocking on the door. So all of us, when we travel for the sake of ilm, we remind ourselves that this is the sunnah of the talabatul ilm from the time of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the time of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there are a number of caravans that would come to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah just to meet the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, the Sahaba, they would travel outside and sometimes they would give da'wah. And some people would accept Islam in distant lands. But would they remain there and not come to Medina to visit the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No, the answer is they would come. They would come and sometimes travel far distances just to meet the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is from the sunan of talabatul ilm. And from the time of the Sahaba, in fact it's mentioned regarding some companions that for the purpose of one hadith, they were willing to travel from Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah all the way to Egypt, just so they could hear one hadith. They heard that another companion had one hadith which he heard from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and just to hear it directly from that companion, he was willing to travel from Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah all the way to Egypt for the purpose of one hadith. For the purpose of one hadith. So rihla for the talibul ilm is something which, or rihla and talabul ilm, these two things are connected. They are connected. Likewise, regarding Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, Al-Imam al-Nasa'i rahimahullah ta'ala considered him the greatest of the narrators from Imam Malik. So I mentioned Imam Malik has a number of ruwat. Al-Nasa'i rahimahullah ta'ala says, or he considers that the best of these ruwat is Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim. And so he did i'timad. He trusted the version of Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim in his Sughra and Kubra. Imam Nasa'i rahimahullah ta'ala has compiled two works in hadith. One is Al-Kubra, it's a larger work. And then he further made that concise and summarized that into what we know as As-Sughra. And he would say, Ibn al-Qasim thiqah, rajulun salih. And then he would say, Subhanallah, ma ahsana hadithahu wa asahahu an Malik. And he would say his hadith is very, very trustworthy and accepted from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. لَيْسَ يَخْتَلِفُ فِي كَلِمَةٍ. And he also says, وَلَمْ يَرْوِ أَحَدٌ الْمُوَطَّة عَنْ مَالِكٍ أَثْبَتَ مِنْ ابن القاسم وليس أحد من أصحاب مالك عندي مثله. Yani Imam al-Nasa'i rahimahullah ta'ala praised the riwayah of Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim a lot, and he accepted it. نعم. And likewise, Ibn Abdul Barr, he says, وَرِوَايَتُهُ عَنْ مَالِكٍ رِوَايَةٌ صَحِيحَةٌ قَلِيلَةُ الْخَطَأِ وَكَانَ فِيمَا رَوَاهُ عَنْ مَالِكٍ مِنْ مُوَطَّئِهِ ثِقَةً حَسَنَ الضَّبْطِ مُتْقِنًا. One of the greatest riwayat of the Muwaṭṭa is the riwayah of Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim. And Al-Qabisi, he says, سمعت أبا القاسم حمزة بن محمد الكناني يقول إذا اختلف الناس عن مالك فالقول ما قال ابن القاسم. يا سلام. This is really important. And you will learn this بإذن الله تعالى in the books of Mustalah, especially when it comes to Ilal al-Hadith. There is a very fine chapter in the books of Mustalah al-Hadith or in Usul al-Hadith, which is known as Ilal al-Hadith. The Muhaddithun, they have two filters that they place. The first filter is the more apparent filter, in order to filter out all of the weak narrations. Scholars of Hadith, they develop two filters. The first one is the more apparent and more explicit and more larger filter that filters out the majority of the weak narrations. And in this filter, they rely on two things, because a mistake in a hadith can only occur in one of two ways. A mistake in a hadith can only occur in one of two ways. Either the person narrating the hadith makes a mistake. We say أخطأ, he makes a mistake. That's number one. The second option is that he intentionally lies. That's the only way there can be a mistake in transmission. Either a person intentionally lies or he makes a mistake. And for both of these, the muhaddithun, the scholars of hadith, they placed conditions. So the condition of adala, which is the religiosity of that individual and his demeanor and the way he carries himself and his character, that condition was placed by the muhaddithun to make sure that it's not possible that he could possibly lie. And as for the second condition, which is dabt, that he has a strong retainment, he's able to retain, he has a strong memory. So either maybe he's narrating from his memory, if that's the case, his memory has to be exceptionally strong. Or he has a book and he's transmitting from his work, his book. In that case, he has to make sure that his book is actually sound and safeguarded with him. This is the condition of dabt. So the muhaddithun place two conditions, adala and dabt, in every single narrator in the chain. And with these two conditions, you have removed the possibility that the person is intentionally lying, and you've also removed the possibility, or the majority of the possibility, that he makes a mistake. But there's still a little possible scenario left, which is that even if his memory is strong, he's still a human being. And humans can make mistakes. So no matter how strong or how great of an imam he is, and how trustworthy he is, and how religious he is, and how much we trust his statement, and how careful he is and meticulous when it comes to transmitting the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even then, it's possible because he's a human being, he could still make a mistake. So for this, the muhaddithun have placed a finer filter, a more precise filter, a filter after the initial filter. And that is what they call ilalul hadith, which is that after the person passes, after they take a single narration and they put it through the larger filter, which is that make sure that the rawi is all of the narrators in the chain. Number one, the chain has to be intact. There has to be ittisal in the sanad. Number two, all of the narrators have to be trustworthy in both aspects, in adala and dabt. So after a narration goes through this filter, then they will further study that narration by cross-comparing it with everyone else who narrates from the same teacher. So for example, Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala has a number of students. And all of these students are transmitting the same narration from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Now let's say all of the students are acceptable, meaning as narrators, as individual narrators, we trust their retainment, we trust their memory, and we trust their religiosity. So they are acceptable as individual narrators. But does that mean they can never make a mistake? The answer is no, they can still make a mistake. So the second filter is to take every single narration and cross-compare it with everyone else who narrates from Imam Malik that same exact narration. Are there any differences or variances, or are they exactly the same? Because technically, if 10 students are all narrating from Imam Malik the same hadith, then all of them should narrate it the same exact way. Because it's all coming from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala at the end of the day. Or if 10 students are narrating from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, the same exact narration, then all of them should narrate the same exact narration in the same way. So after determining that all of the narrators are authentic and acceptable in terms of their retainment and their religiosity, there's a finer filter, and that is to take the narration itself and cross-compare it with the rest of the students of the teacher that this person is narrating that narration from. Are there any differences between these students? And if there are differences, now comes the second filter, which is how do we figure out which one was correct and which one was incorrect? So let's say, for example, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri has 10 students. And out of his 10 students, a number of them narrate the same hadith. It's the same narration that they're narrating from Ibn Shihab. A number of them narrate it in one way, and a few of them narrate it in a different way. So there are a number of different things that the muhaddithun look at over here. Number one is the amount on each side. So let's say 9 of them narrate it one way, and one of the 10 narrates it in a different way. The muhaddithun will give preference to the 9 over the one, and they will say it's possible the one made a mistake. Even if he's acceptable. Even if he's an imam. Even if he's a great scholar of hadith. He could still make a mistake because people are human at the end of the day. But let's say there's, for example, 10 narrators, and 2 or 3 of them narrate it one way. Or let's say, for example, there's only 2. Let's say there's only 2 students of one shaykh. One of them narrates the hadith in one way, and the other one narrates it in a different way. So for example, Imam, or Abdullah ibn Umar, radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, he has 2 students, 2 famous students, Salim and Nafi'. Let's say they differ in certain ahadith. In this scenario, who is given precedence? Which one will be given precedence over the other? So in this regard, the scholars of hadith, they compiled an entire chapter in the books of Jarh and Ta'deel and the books of Mustalah, where they were focusing on the strongest rawi in case there is khilaf that occurs. Who is the strongest student of a certain given shaykh in case there is khilaf that occurs? And this is a really important point. Because to determine the strongest student of a given shaykh, we don't only look at the retainment of that student and the religiosity of that student. We also look at the amount of time that he spent with that shaykh. So for example, one of the greatest students of Anas ibn Malik radiallahu ta'ala anhu is Thabit al-Bunani. And Thabit al-Bunani had many students. From them is Hammad ibn Salama. Now Hammad ibn Salama, by himself as an individual, he is not the strongest of narrators in terms of retainment. But they say when it comes to Thabit, he is the strongest of the students of Thabit. So even if, let's say, there are other students of Thabit that are better than him in general when it comes to retainment, when the hadith is the hadith of Thabit, we will take the version of Hammad ibn Salama. Why? Because if there's a certain scholar that stayed, or a certain student that stayed with his teacher for 10, 15 years, the understanding of that student and the version of that student will be given precedence to the one that stayed with that teacher for only 1 year. Even if the one who stayed for only 1 year was stronger in his memory and stronger in his retainment. Because it's more likely that the one that stayed with this teacher for 10 years remembers what the teacher said better. طيب. So in this regard, there's a chapter which they discuss, which is who is athbatu, or they call it maratibu thiqat. Maratibu al-thiqat. The different levels of the trustworthy narrators. So mentioning that the narrators are trustworthy is not enough. We also create levels between them. And these levels are relative to the teachers of those narrators. So there might be a certain rawi, we say huwa athbatu nasi fi fulan. That narrator, that rawi, he is the most trustworthy of narrators when it comes to the hadith of fulan. But when it comes to other teachers, we might not take his narration and consider it the most trustworthy. So this shows you the meticulous approach of the muhaddithun. And as I mentioned before, ilm al-hadith, guys, and ahbab, is a very, very fine discipline. It's a very, very precise discipline. And the scholars, they went through every logical possibility in their minds before they would arrive at a conclusion and be willing to render a narration as authentic or non-authentic. What's the point of mentioning all of this? Al-Qabisi said over here that I heard from Hamza ibn Muhammad al-Kinani saying, إِذَا اخْتَلَفَ النَّاسُ عَنْ Malik فَالْقَوْلُ مَا قَالَ ابْنُ الْقَاسِمِ. When the students of Malik differ regarding the hadith and all of them are transmitting the same hadith from Malik, which makes no sense, that means someone has to be making a mistake. Because if they're all transmitting the same hadith from Malik, then they all should be transmitting it the same way. He says, فَالْقَوْلُ مَا قَالَ ابْنُ الْقَاسِمِ. Then we will take the version of Ibn al-Qasim. Yani Ibn al-Qasim, rahimahullah ta'ala, Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, is one of the strongest students of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala. Na'am. طيب, then we have the riwayah, number 6, we have the riwayah of Abdullah ibn Maslamat al-Qa'nabi. He is Abu Abdurrahman al-Madani, who eventually lived in Basra, who passed away in the year 221. And Imam Bukhari and Muslim both transmit a hadith from, or mention the hadith of Abdullah ibn Maslamat al-Qa'nabi, and he is from the Rijal of Sahihain. And he is also a thiqah. And he says, لَزِمْتُ مَالِكًا 20 سَنَةً حَتَّى قَرَأْتُ عَلَيْهِ الْمُوَطَّة. I stayed with Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala for how many years? 20 years until I read upon him the Muwaṭṭa. And this is also really important. The students of the past, the majority of them, this is known as mulazama. They would stay with their mashayikh for a long period of time. Not 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. No. They would stay with them for a long period of time. And the majority of the biographies of the ulama of the past that you will study, you will find that they spent over 10 years, minimum. Some of them 30 years. Like Imam Malik, we mentioned regarding him, that how many years did he spend with Abdurrahman ibn Hurmuz? Around 30 years. And he mentioned regarding himself that I used to continue going to him for around 30 years. And the truth is, till today, there are some ulama that are like this. Some mashayikh that I had in Medina Munawwara, whenever they would hold a dars, they would bring their shaykh to the dars. Even though the students were mainly coming for the actual shaykh. But out of respect, he would always bring his teacher that taught him 30 years ago to the dars and make it seem as if the dars was actually the dars of his teacher and not his own dars. Out of respect for their teachers. And Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, he also stayed with Hamad, his teacher, for 17 years. And Imam Shafi rahimahullah ta'ala, as we mentioned, stayed with Imam Malik for around 15 to 17 years. And this was very common amongst the talabatul ilm and the ulama of the earlier centuries. They would not replace their teacher until their teacher passed away. This was from their adab with their mashayikh. And if their mashayikh were present, then they would refuse from giving fatwa, even if they knew the answer sometimes. And this is possible. At times, someone might know the answer better than his own shaykh. But they would refuse from giving an answer if their teachers were present. تَأَدُّبًا مَعَهُمْ, out of respect for their teachers. So he says, I stayed with Imam Malik for how many years? 20 years. حَتَّى قَرَأْتُ عَلَيْهِ الْمُوَطَّة, until I read upon him the Muwaṭṭa. And then another benefit of this riwayah, Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi, is that Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi read the Muwaṭṭa himself upon Imam Malik. And regarding this, Ismail ibn Ishaq al-Qadi, he says, كان القعنبي لا يرضى قراءة حبيب فما زال يجهد حتى قرأ بنفسه الموطأ على مالك. And how long did it take him, as we mentioned? 20 years. And he kept on pushing until he finally got the chance to read himself to Imam Malik the Muwaṭṭa. He was not willing, he was not accepting that Habib, the actual Qari Imam Malik, who was a normal reader for Imam Malik, he was not willing to have him read and him listen, by himself just have to listen. He kept on pushing until he got the opportunity to read, and eventually he read. And Al-Ijli mentions قرأ مالك عليه نصف الموطأ وقرأ هو على مالك النصف الباقي. He also mentions that Imam Malik himself read half of the Muwaṭṭa upon his student Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi. And that's why a lot of scholars, they consider the riwayah of al-Qa'nabi the greatest riwayah. So some, as I mentioned, consider the riwayah of Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim, and some have done taqdeem of the riwayah of al-Qa'nabi. That's why Ibn Abi Hatim, he says, I asked my father, Al-Qa'nabi ahabbu ilayka fil Muwaṭṭa aw Ismail ibn Abi Uwais? Qala, Al-Qa'nabi ahabbu ilay lam ara akhsha'a minhu. And Yahya bin Ma'in was asked regarding the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. So he said, أثبت الناس في الموطأ عبد الله بن مسلمة القعنبي وعبد الله بن يوسف التنيسي. So Yahya bin Ma'in gave tarjih to the riwayah, gave preference to the riwayah of Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi. We mentioned before, An-Nasa'i gave preference to the riwayah of the previous one. And over here, Yahya bin Ma'in is giving riwayah to preference to the riwayah of Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi. طيب. And likewise, Musa ibn Sa'd al-Bardani, he asked Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Amman aktub al-Muwaṭṭa? Who should I write the Muwaṭṭa from? Meaning, which one of the students of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala should I go to and take the Muwaṭṭa from? فقال اكتبه عن القعنبي. Take it from Qa'nabi. So Abdullah ibn Maslamah al-Qa'nabi is also a famous rawi of the Muwaṭṭa and one of the most important riwayat. طيب. Number 7, we have the riwayah of Abdullah ibn Wahb al-Qurashi, who is Abdullah ibn Wahb bin Muslim al-Qurashi al-Fihri, Abu Muhammad al-Misri al-Faqih, who was born in the year 125 and passed away in the year 197. And he is also a thiqa, an acceptable and trustworthy narrator. And he heard the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala at a young age. And he memorized the Muwaṭṭa before he met the teacher. And he himself, he says, حفظت Muwaṭṭa Malik ما بين مصر إلى المدينة. He was traveling from Egypt all the way to Medina just to study from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. In that journey, he memorized the entire Muwaṭṭa. So by the time he got to Medina, he had memorized the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, and he was prepared, or he already memorized all the hadith, and then he just received them from Imam Malik. طيب. Number 8, we have the riwayah of Abdullah ibn Yusuf at-Tinnisi, who's also Egyptian. Al-Misri asluhu min Dimashq. And he is originally from Damascus. وَنَزَلَ التِّنِّيسِ, and then he eventually stayed in At-Tinnis. And he's also a thiqa. And Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala says regarding him, كَانَ مِنْ أَثْبَتِ الشَّامِيِّينَ. He was from the strongest scholars, the most trustworthy narrators of the Shawam, from Sham. And Ibn Adi, he says, وَعَبْدُ ibn Yusuf صَدُوقٌ لَا بَأْسَ بِهِ. And he heard from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala as well in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah. And Nasr ibn Marzuq, he says, ما بقي أحد على وجه الأرض أوثق من عبد الله ibn Yusuf. So Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, many times in his Sahih, he narrates from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala by way of Abdullah ibn Yusuf at-Tinnisi. By way of Abdullah ibn Yusuf at-Tinnisi. طيب. Now, then you have the riwayah of Muhammad ibn Mubarak al-Suri, who passed away in the year 215, who was also a thiqah. And we have the riwayah of Mus'ab bin Abdullah al-Zubayri. The riwayah of Mus'ab bin Abdullah al-Zubayri, who passed away in the year 230. And he also heard, or he also read the Muwaṭṭa, he also received it from Imam Malik rahimahullahu ta'ala with the recitation of Habib. And then you have number 11, the riwayah of Mutarrif ibn Abdullah, Abu Mus'ab al-Madani. And Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala is his uncle. Imam Malik is the uncle of Mutarrif ibn Abdullah. He passed away in the year 220. And Mutarrif ibn Abdullah is also a narrator who is accepted. He is trustworthy. And Ibn Adi, for some reason, he spoke regarding the riwayah of Mutarrif from Malik. And he said, يحدث عن ابن أبي ذئب وعبد الله بن عمر ومالك وغيرهم بالمناكير. And he mentioned regarding Mutarrif ibn Abdullah, the nephew of Imam Malik rahimahullah, that sometimes he narrates a hadith from Imam Malik that are manakir. Over here means they are narrations that only you find with him. And normally amongst the scholars of hadith, when you find that there's a teacher that's very famous and he has many students, and then you find one of the students for some reason has certain narrations from that teacher, none of his other students narrate from him. They call these ahadith manakir. They're also known as gharaib. So munkar comes in the meaning of gharib in the mustalah of the muhaddithin. And this is something which indicates that most likely there is weakness in those narrations. Because again, if a teacher has many students, it's very unlikely that there are certain narrations no one knows of from all of his students other than one student. So the tafarrud of one student, the fact that one student individually is narrating certain narrations and he's the only one narrating those narrations from his teacher, this raises a question mark. So Ibn Adi claimed that Mutarrif ibn Abdullah has manakir from Imam Malik. However, Al-Dhahabi says this is not correct. He says, هذه أباطيل حاشا مطرفا من روايتها. In reality, what was happening over here is that the teacher of Ibn Adi, who is Ahmad ibn Dawood, he was the one making the mistakes. But Ibn Adi trusted his teacher and he placed the blame on who? Mutarrif ibn Abdullah. Ibn Adi came later on in the 4th century. So he trusted his teacher who was the link between him and Mutarrif, and he thought Mutarrif was the one coming along with all these manakir, when in reality it was his teacher. Okay, so this is not accepted. What Ibn Adi says regarding Mutarrif is not accepted. Rather, Mutarrif is a thiqah, and he is accepted and trustworthy in the riwayah of Muwaṭṭa. Number 12, we have the riwayah of Ma'an ibn Isa al-Qazzaz, Abu Yahya al-Madani, who passed away in the year 198. And he is also a thiqah. And he was also from the main students of Imam Malik and the mulazimeen of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. In fact, Imam Malik, when he was older, when he would exit towards the masjid, he would lean on Ma'an ibn Isa. Until they started saying regarding Ma'an ibn Isa, Usayyatu Malik, that he's like the staff of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And he himself read the Muwaṭṭa himself upon Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. He himself read the entire Muwaṭṭa himself upon Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And that's why a number of scholars, they mention Ma'an ibn Isa to be one of the strongest students of and transmitters of the Muwaṭṭa from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is why Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, around 83 ahadith in his Jami', he mentions them through the tariq, or through his teacher. Imam Tirmidhi's teacher is Ishaq ibn Musa al-Ansari, from Ma'an ibn Isa from Imam Malik. So Imam Tirmidhi never met Ma'an ibn Isa. Ma'an ibn Isa passed away in 198. And Imam Tirmidhi was born in 209. So he never met Ma'an ibn Isa, but between him and Ma'an was Ishaq ibn Musa al-Ansari. But he did i'timad, he trusted the version of Muwaṭṭa through Ma'an ibn Isa. So he mentions around 83 ahadith in his Jami'. The most that Imam Tirmidhi relies on, transmitting from Imam Malik, is Ma'an ibn Isa. And also he relies on Qutaybah from Malik as well, although Ma'an is more. Like number 13, we have the riwayah of Yahya ibn Bukayr, al-Qurashi al-Makhzumi. And some scholars said regarding him that he's da'if. He is weak. And he's not a trustworthy narrator. And others have said that he is saduq and he's acceptable. However, we say that he is acceptable, meaning the ones who did tad'if of him are not correct. In fact, Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala does ikhraj of his hadith from Imam Malik in Sahih al-Bukhari. Yes, he has some tafarrudat, meaning he has certain narrations that he's the only one transmitted from Imam Malik. So those are questionable, but overall, his احتج به الشيخان. Yani we say Imam Bukhari and Muslim, both of them, used him as ihtijaj, they used him as a trustworthy narrator. Naam. So we say what's correct in this as well is that his narration from Imam Malik is acceptable, it's trustworthy. And this was also his narration, Yahya ibn Bukayr, was accepted by Baqi ibn Makhlad. We mentioned Baqi ibn Makhlad, he trusted Abu Mus'ab, the riwayah of Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri in his Musnad, and he also trusted the riwayah of Yahya ibn Bukayr in his Musnad. If you remember, we said Baqi ibn Makhlad was from Andalus. So he wasn't willing to place the riwayah of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi. So he himself, he says, لما وضعت مسندي جاءني عبيد الله وإسحاق ابن يحيى. The two sons of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, they came to me when I compiled my Musnad. And the Musnad of Baqi is one of the greatest encyclopedias of hadith. Unfortunately, we don't have that today with us. We don't have it today with us. Otherwise, it was one of the greatest encyclopedias of hadith. So he says, when I compiled my Musnad, the two sons of Yahya ibn Yahya, they came to me, Ubaydullah and Ishaq, and they said to me, بلغنا أنك وضعت كتابا قدمت فيه أبا مصعب الزهري ويحيى بن بكير وأخرت أبانا. And in your book, you didn't mention the riwayah of our father, you only mentioned the riwayah of who? Or you mentioned the version, the hadith of Imam Malik, you mentioned it through the chain of Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri and Yahya ibn Bukayr. But you didn't mention our father. Why? So he says, I replied by saying, أما تقديمي أبا مصعب فلقول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قدموا قريش ولا تقدموها. يا سلام. He says, as for me taking the riwayah of Abu Mus'ab, because the Messenger himself, صلى الله عليه وسلم, he says, قدموا قريشا. And Abu Mus'ab we mentioned is from Quraysh. So the Messenger said, bring forth the people of Quraysh. Keep them in the forefront. ولا تقدموها, and don't go ahead of them. And the Imma are from Quraysh. So because the Messenger said this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, for this hadith, I considered from all the students of Imam Malik, I considered Abu Mus'ab, because he was from Quraysh, he was Qurashi, to be the most, or I did taqdeem of his riwayah. And as for Ibn Bukayr, because he was older than your father. And he says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كبر الكبر. The Messenger in a number of hadith, in fact, this is, as a side point, we'll just mention, the idea of respecting the one who is older than you is part of Islam. This is within our faith, just because of their age. And there are a number of narrations that indicate upon them. There are a number of narrations that indicate upon this. That respecting the one who is older than you in age is from our deen. It's from our deen. In fact, one time there was an event that occurred where there were two individuals, they went on a journey, and one of them in the process was killed by some other individuals from this whole story that occurred. And the one that remained alive, he eventually came back and he wanted to narrate the story to the Messenger ﷺ of what had transpired and what happened and how they were, what happened with his companion. So he came, they were cousins, the two that went and traveled together. He came with his elder brother, the one that remained, and he came back to Medina. He came to the Messenger ﷺ with his elder brother. The elder brother was not part of the event. He didn't travel with the cousin, the younger cousin, or the younger brother. So who is the Sahib al-Qissa? Who is the one who actually was there at the time of the event? The younger brother, not the elder brother. But when they come to the Messenger ﷺ and the younger brother, he starts to speak, the Messenger says, no, stop. The older one, you speak. The older one, you speak. And likewise, the Messenger one day, or he's seen in a dream, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that he gave a siwak to a younger person and he was told to give it to the one who's elder. So in our religion, respecting the one who's older for the sake of him simply being older, this is part of our deen. This is part of our deen. And this is necessary in any civilization that is meant to remain intact. That the young respect the ones that are older than them. And they don't rebel against them. Everyone will become old. So your day will come, inshallah, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But when you're young, respect the ones that are older than you. طيب. So he says, why did I take the riwayah of Yahya ibn Bukayr over the riwayah of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi? Simply because he was older in age. That's it. Simple as that. Simple as that. Okay. MashaAllah, the ones who are older, I see them smiling. They got to remember there's older people than them too, right? وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Naam. So just the same way everyone who's knowledgeable, there's someone more knowledgeable above them. Likewise, everyone who's of older age, it's relative, right? It's going to be someone older than you too. So it goes both ways. You demand respect and you take respect, but you also give respect. Naam. طيب. The 14th riwayah is the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya an-Naysaburi. The riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya an-Naysaburi, who passed away in the year 226. And many praised him as well. To the point that Imam Ahmad rahimahullah he says, ما أخرجت خراسان بعد ابن المبارك مثل يحيى بن يحيى. In Khurasan has not produced after Ibn al-Mubarak the likes of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. And that's why Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala in his Sahih, the main i'timad he has in the transmission of the Muwaṭṭa from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala is upon the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Yahya bin Yahya al-Naysaburi. Both of them are Yahya bin Yahya. One of them is Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, the other one is Yahya bin Yahya al-Naysaburi. So these are the famous riwayat of the Muwaṭṭa, and we also have the most famous, or one of the most famous riwayat as well, which is the riwayat of Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani. We'll talk about this, inshallah, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, afterwards, individually when we speak about Imam Muhammad. As for these riwayat, we say a lot of these riwayat, they were accepted, and they were transmitted, and they continued to be transmitted until the 9th and the 10th century after Hijrah. So for example, the riwayat of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, and the riwayat of Abu Mus'ab, and Ibn Bukayr, and Al-Qa'nabi, and Al-Shaybani, and Ma'an, and Ibn Ufayr, all of them, they continue to be transmitted until the 9th and the 10th century. When we say they were continuously transmitted, what does that mean? That means that the Muwaṭṭa of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, it continuously was transmitted generation upon generation with all of these riwayat. Throughout the first 9 to 10 centuries after migration. However, after the 10th century, and we can actually keep this date, this is really important. After the 10th century, there's a massive decline in Islamic academia across the globe, in all of the sciences, including the science of hadith and other sciences as well. So there was initially, the 2nd century and 3rd century. We say the 3rd century is the golden century. That is the era where all of the ulum, the disciplines of Islam, the different disciplines that we study, they reached their peak in the 3rd century. And after that, they were slightly stagnant. They weren't evolving in any way. Until the 6th, 7th, and 8th century. 7th century, 8th century, again, there was another incline that occurred. So the same disciplines that were discussed, for example, you'll find this in a number of ulum, whether it's usul al-fiqh, whether it's fiqh, whether it's hadith, usul al-hadith. You'll find that initially there was an incline, and then around the 3rd century, there's a plateau. So it just levels out, and it remains stagnant. The science, after the 3rd century, it becomes still, as if there's no incline in the actual discipline itself. Until the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th century. In the 7th and 8th century, there was a massive incline in all of the ulum. So in the science of usul al-fiqh, in the science of usul al-hadith, in the science of nahwa, for example. In all of these ulum, there was a massive incline once again. And these ulum, they evolved. And this occurred till the 10th century. And then after the 10th century, there was a plateau. In fact, we can't call it, they weren't stagnant, there was a decline. And the ulum, they continue to decline until today. So if you look at the level of the scholars a century ago, or 1.5 centuries ago, you'll find that they are far more knowledgeable than the scholarship of today. And if you compare that with the scholars that were 5 centuries ago, in the 9th century and the 8th century, you will be amazed at the amount of ilm they had. And you'll think to yourself, how were these individuals, human beings, able to write and compile all of what they compiled? The amounts of books that they compiled, not read, compiled, they wrote down. It leaves you astonished and shocked. Like Ibn Hajar and As-Suyuti rahimahullah. And the great giants, everyone knows, students of knowledge, we know, great ulama existed in the 9th and 8th century. But now there is a decline. Since the 10th century, there was a decline. So scholars of 2 centuries ago were lesser in knowledge compared to the ones that were 5 centuries ago. And then, after that, the scholars of today are far lesser in knowledge compared to the scholars of 1.5 century ago. And the seminaries, Islamic seminaries, the institutions, the standards of academia is dropping too, at a very strong rate, compared to the standards that existed 1-2 centuries ago. And one of the reasons for this, I have to mention this, is a really important point. One of the reasons for this is a really important reason, and you have to keep this in mind, is the conversion of the framework of teaching Islamic academia to the Western framework of academia, which are Western universities. So in all of the Islamic lands, what you have happening in the last 50 years is that they are replicating and mimicking the process and the method of teaching that was adopted by the Western universities. And there is benefit to this and there is harm. What is the benefit? The benefit is that in Western academia, specializations are prioritized, as opposed to generic, wholesome, conclusive knowledge. What they're focused on more is specialization. So right now, for example, if you go to your family doctor, the family doctor, if you have an issue, for example, with your skin, where does he send you? Specialist in skin. If you have an issue, for example, with something else, where does he send you? He sends you to specialists because he himself has no knowledge regarding it. You ask yourself, how is he a doctor? Well, that's how doctors are, because they're specializing. They're not attaining wholesome and generic knowledge. The whole process of the idea of the bachelor's and the master's and the PhD, the bachelor's is a bit more generic, and the master's even though it's not generic completely, because you have a major, right? In your bachelor's, in your university, in your undergrad, you have a major, and then you have other electives that you take. So the major is specifying one science for you. And then after you do that major, then you go into your master's and PhD, and that is simply research, and that is even more detailed and more narrow than the initial bachelor's. So the knowledge is not attained in a wholesome manner. Rather, you start off limited, and you get even more limited the more you go forward. The more you move forward, you get more and more limited. So they're creating researchers, and they're not creating generic, wholesome scholars. Now, there's a benefit to this, and that benefit is that you're able to advance your research in very, very fine and detailed matters. You're able to advance research in those fine and detailed discussions and that type of research you would have never been able to attain it before. So the increase of research, that is the pro. But what is the con? The con is that you're creating individuals that no longer have shumul in their ilm. Their knowledge is not wholesome. Rather, it's a very, very narrow and precise form of knowledge. Now, maybe, for example, in medicine, it's not that big of a problem. But when you transfer the same system over to Islamic ulum, what's the issue? Now when they go to universities, when you go to a university, and let's say you want to specialize in hadith, that means you know absolutely nothing regarding fiqh and usul al-fiqh and lugha and anything else. And let's say you want to specialize in usul al-fiqh, legal theory. That means you know nothing regarding usul al-hadith or fiqh or anything else. Let's say you want to specialize in qira'at. Then definitely 100% you know nothing regarding any of the other disciplines. So even if you get a PhD, for example, a doctorate, in specialization in hadith, like what about everything else? That is a big problem. So the fact that, and Islamic ulum, these disciplines are all connected. They are murtabita. It's necessary that they all go hand in hand. So you cannot understand hadith properly without fiqh. And you cannot study fiqh properly without hadith. And you can't study hadith or fiqh without usul al-hadith and usul al-fiqh. And you cannot understand the Quran without tafsir. And you can't understand the commandments of our Sharia without all of them together, without lugha, without Arabic. Everything is dependent on Arabic. So now if someone really wants to become a scholar, you have to study everything. But what ends up happening is that when they introduce this system into the universities, Islamic universities, you're creating a very narrow pathway for the student of knowledge. And the more advanced he gets, the more narrow his pathway becomes. And they used to say back in the days, من تكلم في غير فنه أتى بالعجائب. That the person who used to address and he used to give fatwa or who used to speak in matters and disciplines that he himself didn't study, أتى بالعجائب. He would bring wonders and ideas that no one would have ever heard of before. And the same thing you have today now. You have individuals speaking regarding fiqh. They might have PhDs in other sciences. But when they speak about fiqh, they're speaking about a discipline they didn't study at all. But they feel that they have the authority to speak regarding it. The benefit in medicine is that if the family doctor starts giving you prescriptions regarding very specific matters that he's supposed to send you to the specialist for, what happens? They remove his license and they stop him from practicing. That doesn't occur in Islamic sciences. So it doesn't matter, as long as you have a degree from wherever you attain that degree, you can speak about whatever you want regarding Islam, and it's as if you are an authority and religious authority in that regard. And this results in a lot of fitna. And it has resulted in a lot of fitna, where there are individuals that might be accepted as scholars, but when you look at what they studied, you'll see that they're only specialized in certain sciences. Okay, so imagine someone, for example, studying abroad for 14, 15, 16, 17, 20 years, and they come back, and you would think that they're a great alim. But if you actually look at the books they studied, you will realize, okay, in fiqh, they never have actually studied even one madhab, one school of thought properly, level by level, with progression. It doesn't exist. So it raises that question mark that, this is a serious problem. That's why one of our teachers, he used to say that even if there was good intent in the initial, for example, bringing of this university system within the Islamic world, at the same time, it is resulting in Islamic academia being destroyed. Destroyed. in a way that unfortunately, subhanAllah, well, we know, we've been through that system, right? We've seen that system. Okay, and also in university, guys, anyone who's studying university, for example, over here, the students, all they care about is passing. They don't care about knowing. They care about what? Passing. So they just study in order for them to pass. And if they can cut corners, what are they going to do? They're going to cut corners because you're giving them a degree in the end. So do we really think that's not happening in Islamic disciplines, in Islamic universities? 100% is happening. So there are scholars that are becoming scholars by cutting corners and simply passing along. And in the eyes of the layman, they're all under the same umbrella and they're all painted with the same brush of scholarship, and as if they're all religious authorities. When they can drastically be, different when it comes to their actual level of Islamic academia and their understanding of Islam in totality. So we say after the 10th century there was a decline. And that decline also occurred where? In Ilm al-Hadith. The decline also occurred in Ilm al-Hadith. However, Ilm al-Hadith, like all the ulum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will keep these ulum alive. Sometimes the ulum are kept alive on a larger scale, and sometimes the ulum are kept alive on a minor scale with certain individuals. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say He kept these disciplines alive with certain individuals in certain places. And this is also really interesting. Our Shaykh, one of our teachers, he always used to mention this, that if you look throughout the way these disciplines were kept alive until today, you'll find that qira'at, for example, it used to be very, very famous in the eastern part of the Islamic world. Until the 5th century and 6th century when the Tatar attacked Baghdad and they destroyed the capital of the Abbasid Khilafah, then ilm al-qira'at pretty much died out in the eastern part of the world. But it remained alive in the western part of the world. Ilm al-qira'at remained alive in the western part of the world, where Ad-Dani, for example, was the first one who brought the Sab'a qira'at to the west, and then his student Shatibi, for example, he compiled Hirz al-Amani, and then that became famous from there, and then eventually it came into Egypt. Ibn al-Jazari and other great scholars in Egypt, for example, who served ilm al-qira'at until eventually it stayed until today in those lands. Likewise, all of the disciplines, you will see sometimes they're in this land, and then after some time it transfers over to that land, and then after some time it will go into a third land, and so on and so forth. As for ilm al-hadith, in the beginning ilm al-hadith was in Medina. The beginning ilm al-hadith was in Medina in the time of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. But in the 3rd century, look at the majority of the scholars of hadith. Where are they? They're not in Medina Munawwara. Imam Bukhari was not from Medina. Imam Tirmidhi was not from Medina. Imam Muslim was not from Medina. Imam Abu Dawud was not from Medina. Imam Nasa'i was not from Medina. And Ibn Majah was not from Medina. None of them were from Medina. They were in other parts of the Muslim world. So ilm al-hadith, it became very famous in Iraq, became very famous in Bilad ma wara al-Nahr. And then it continued on, so on and so forth. Until eventually, we can say in the 6th and 7th and 8th century, ilm al-hadith was very, very dominant in Egypt, in Misr. But after the 10th century, we mentioned there was a decline worldwide. And ilm al-hadith remained alive where? In the Indian subcontinent. So for the past 2 to 3 centuries, ilm al-hadith has remained alive where? In the Indian subcontinent. And this is just the truth. That's why the majority of the asanid today, they go through the major asanid. They go through who? An individual by the name of Shah Waliullah ad-Dihlawi, who was from India, and he lived around 2.5 centuries ago. He traveled to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara and he stayed there for a period of 2 years. And he studied from Abu Tahir al-Kurdi over there. And he read the entire Bukhari over there, and he studied ilm al-hadith, and he came back and he started spreading it in the Indian subcontinent. And through him, ilm al-hadith remained alive. So why is this important? We said the riwayat of Muwaṭṭa were continuously being recited where? In the eastern part of the world, in the first 9 to 10 centuries, Islamic world. And from the 10th century onwards, there's 2 riwayat that remain very famous out of all of the riwayat of Muwaṭṭa. And those 2 are the riwayat of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, number 1, and number 2 is the riwayat of Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. And why is this the case? The riwayat of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi was accepted and it spread for one reason, or for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Maghariba, the scholars in the West, as I mentioned, they were always Maliki and they always remain Maliki until today they're Maliki. And so they continued transmitting this riwayah, the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. But number 2, because Shah Waliullah ad-Dihlawi also studied the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi and came and spread it in Egypt. And likewise, the riwayah of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. The reason why this riwayah remained alive, and especially has become very famous in the last 2 centuries, is because Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani is also the great student of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. And because the Indian subcontinent, the majority of the scholars over there and the people over there follow the Hanafi school of thought, they also focused a lot on the riwayah of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. They also focused a lot on the riwayah of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. And so these riwayat, they remain alive till today. Till today. And there are two books that we can say regarding them. In every single century until now, they have always been recited and studied. And there has never been an area or a time period where, for example, they weren't being read upon teachers. Those are the Sahih of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala and the Muwaṭṭa with the riwayah of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Muwaṭṭa bi riwayat Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. We say these two books, every single century till now, they have always been accepted and scholars have been teaching them and reading and on a continuous basis. So we call this sama' muttasil, that there is continuous sama' occurring. Every student is studying this book upon their teachers, and they're studying upon their teachers, and they're studying upon their teachers, and so on until the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there's no ijaza within the asanid in between. That doesn't mean ijaza didn't exist. It did exist. However, for the most part, these two riwayat are the most famous, these two books, Bukhari and Muwaṭṭa bi riwayat Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, they've been transmitted with sama' muttasil till now. طيب, we'll stop over here, and the next lesson, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we'll start with the tarjama of Al-Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. We're going to go through a brief biography of Imam Muhammad, and maybe 1-2 lessons, maybe 3 lessons. We'll see how many more lessons we do in the muqaddimat, and then we'll start with the actual book, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.